Welcome to Brave New Us, where we explore what it means to be human in the age of biotechnology. I'm here today with Emma Waters, a research associate at the Heritage Foundation and sharp cultural commentator on emerging biotech trends. In a recent article, Emma explores how Silicon Valley elites, once known for pushing depopulation and reproductive control, are now leading a curious pronatalist movement. But behind the talk of baby bonuses and tech enhanced families lies a deeper question. What kind of people are we trying to create? And who gets to decide? We discuss how this new wave of pronatalism intersects with genetic screening, embryo selection, three parent children, and the quiet rebranding of eugenics for a 21st century audience. Is this really about saving humanity or redesigning it? Emma, welcome to Brave New Us.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today.
Absolutely. So, can you tell us about your work and how you came to be doing what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started off in the family policy space in college, studying everything related to marriage and family structure studies and policies that could encourage or hinder the development of intact families. And from there, I became increasingly interested in the role of technology as it was sort of reimagining every aspect of our life, from digital technology to our understanding of sex with the gender ideology movement, and then ultimately landing in this space of reproductive technology, realizing that in many ways our technology is reimagining how we think of conception and what it means to be human at that most fundamental level. And so over the years, I've worked for a number of scholars, but have primarily been at the Heritage Foundation building out our platform on reproductive technology and emerging biotechnology, always with the question of what does it mean to be human and how do we promote family flourishing through the technologies we promote.
Excellent. So, in your recent article for Public Discourse, you distinguish between pronatalism and pro family. What do you mean by that, and why do you think this distinction is important?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, it's been a really exciting development in the last couple of years to see the topic of declining birth rates and pronatalism really come into the mainstream discussion. For many years, it was something that floated around academia and niche circles, but hadn't really entered into mainstream discourse. And so, in many ways, we have Elon Musk and a few very prominent figures like that to thank for the awareness that's been garnered over the last few years about declining birth rates. So, a little bit on that. Birth rates in the United States as of 2023, so it's a bit dated now, but it takes a while to get the information in, have declined to 1.62 births on average per woman. And typically, scholars say that in order for a nation to maintain its population levels, you need to have about an average of 2.1 children born per woman. And even more than that if you want to grow your nation. And so, in some levels, it may just seem like a numbers game. What's the big deal? We have fewer children now, we'll have more children later. But a lot of folks in the pronatalism space have recognized the continued downward trend and have been very alarmed by it because declining birth rates mean we have fewer people to support the nation, which means we have fewer people in our military, in our education, in research and development. It affects things like our social security, our unemployment, our elder care, and it really begins to impact multiple levels where you have countries like China or Japan, for example, whose birth rates have declined to such a degree that they're concerned that the nation may not be able to sustain itself in coming years. So, not destroyed by the enemy outside, but destroyed by the enemy within. And like to put this in perspective, South Korea, which has the lowest birth rates in the world, I think their birth rates are at zero point 0.7. For every 100 South Koreans that are alive today, they will only have, on average, about 7 grandchildren because of how low birth rates are. So it's an incredibly, I think, heartbreaking conversation when you start thinking about the real personal impact. But pronatalism is a movement that's risen in response to that, who's promoting, as the name implies, more babies being born. And so, at face value, right, like we support more babies being born to families who want to have them. But it's that distinction right there that I think is so key. Pronatalism is strictly concerned with more babies being born, but many in the movement don't actually care whether those babies are being born to married mothers and fathers. Whereas the distinction that I would make, which is the pro family movement, where I really orient myself, says that we're not simply concerned about having more babies, but we're concerned with more families being formed in the United States. And we want to see more healthy marriages established between men and women. And from those healthy marriages, couples having the children that they desire. Because ultimately, if we have a nation where artificial wombs are used just to create literally more babies, or in the case of Elon Musk, who has multiple women who have had multiple children, either as surrogates or in these sort of like financial agreements, while every child is a gift that's conceived and born, we have to be very honest about the quality of life that we're giving to those children. And so, if we're just having children who have no natural connection to their mother and father, we're actually setting those children up to have a much harder life, based on a number of studies and research that's been done on child well-being and family formation. And so that's why I make that distinction between pronatalism proper and then the pro-family movement, which I think is the better response to our current cultural problems around birth and the decline in healthy marriages.
So I obviously agree with you, but just to play this out, what is the problem with somebody like Elon Musk, reproducing with his harem or with an artificial womb? What, as long as he might say, I have the means to take care of these children. I obviously have fabulous genetics. Look at what I have accomplished and look at my intellect. And why would I, if we need more babies, aren't I the best candidate? I can fund as many as we can put out there in the world. What would be the problem with that, and why would we necessarily want more families who are ill equipped, or certainly less equipped financially speaking than somebody like Musk, to reproduce their babies?
Yeah, and this is a fantastic question and pushback. So I think there are two things that come to mind, two things we've already seen play out in response to this. The first is materialism, and the second is the impact on the child. So taking the materialism angle, I think when it comes to this conversation, Elon Musk, who is literally one of the richest men in the world, without a doubt, right, has the means to have many, many children and provide financially whatever they need. The problem, however, is that unfortunately, I don't have nearly as much money as Elon Musk. You probably don't, and the average American doesn't either, right? Our average median income is, I think, somewhere between like $50,000, $60,000. And so when we have these expectations set by an elite class, and elite classes are very good for setting the moral standards for a nation. And if you have individuals like Elon Musk saying it's really not about the families, it's about the money, can you provide for them? And why shouldn't I? Then I think we run into a problem where the cultural expectation that he sets is that you need to be able to provide your children the best life possible with as much money possible and everything they could want or need. And he can do that, but the average American can't. And so they'll look at figures like Elon Musk, who certainly do have enough money to procreate at that level, and say, well, I can't do the same thing. Why should I even bother to have children if he's going to take care of it, if others with enough money are going to take care of it? And whether Elon Musk likes it or not, he won't literally be able to have enough children to address the declining birth rate problem. And this overemphasis on having certain kinds of children and giving them every possible material thing that they need, I think could actually end up suppressing birth rates for everyone else, which is what we've actually seen with the rise of materialism in years past. And the second thing I would say is then you have to ask, what about the children who are being formed in this arrangement? So on average, non-resident fathers only spend about 30 minutes per week with their children. And even like the best fathers with the best of intentions, there's just natural barriers that come into play when you're not in the home. And take someone like Elon Musk, who has many children living in many cities with different women. He's actually proposed the idea of a commune where they all have individual houses to try to solve this problem, right? But he travels a lot. And so there's this question of like, how much time does Elon even get with his children, especially if he was child maxing on a larger scale. And so I think when we think about this issue of like, just have tons of kids, it doesn't matter, or say artificial wombs, right? Say, well, what if we just create the babies through in vitro fertilization? We then implant those embryos in an artificial womb. They raise the kids, and then whomever wants the child, a single person, a couple, a throuple, a same sex relationship or not, can come pick them up. Well, we're actually conferring massive harms and risks onto that child just to fulfill the desires of adults. And this is something Katie Faust has said very elegantly when she says that we can't let the desires of adults come before the needs of children. And I think case in point is looking again at Elon Musk. His oldest son in recent years has really rebelled against Elon Musk because of this technology and this pronatalism detached from the family that he's promoted. So Elon Musk's oldest son now goes by Vivian and is very openly talked about how incredibly angry he is and how frustrated he is with how his father chose to create him in a lab, select him for his sex, and really engineer every part of his life for the purpose of having more babies, but not really providing him with a home, with unconditional love, with a family to raise him. And there are other articles that have started coming out with children sort of raised in this pronatalist mindset that have, I think, really started to suffer the harms of that. And then just by and large, we know that children who are raised with an intact married mother father, like biological mother father family, do the best when it comes to their psychological, their emotional, their behavioral, educational, and in some ways their financial outcomes. And so, if we're simply encouraging a more babies movement detached from that married mother and father, then we're placing children in situations where they are less likely to thrive. This doesn't mean that they will all do horribly or be unhappy, right? But we are setting them in a situation where we're intentionally putting them in a situation where it will be harder for them to do so. And I think a lot of this really does come down to these sort of like big picture ideals versus like the lived experience of what is good for children. And the last thing I'll say on this is there was an article in the Washington Post written by a woman last year where she basically said, okay, fine, we have declining birth rates. I'll grant you that it's a problem for our national health and security and unemployment and elder care, et cetera. But what does this have to do with me? Why should I, as a woman, bear the responsibility of this broader issue? And so she basically, somewhat crassly says, sure, if you think there's a problem with declining birth rates, then figure out a solution that doesn't involve women having babies. She was like, because I don't care. And I think the thing that her article most really pointed out to me is that if we make this about increasing birth rates simply, then it does become a bit of, I think we hit a situation where women start to opt out and they say, that's great, you want increased birth rates, but yeah, basically like what's in it for me, and if I don't want kids, then why should I be engaged? And we've removed the human element, the family element from it, that it really, I think, flattens the appeal societally. And this is something we've actually seen in China, where China's now throwing tons of money and messaging incentives and cultural status to women who have babies. And women in China are literally saying, yeah, I think we're good. We're just going to pursue our career. We really don't care about your national crisis. Figure it out yourself. And so detach children from the family, from married mothers and fathers, I think you inevitably hit moments like that. And long term, that actually is going to decrease birth rates even further and sort of undermine the initial goal of pronatalism to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. And something you said, you were talking about defining the best life possible and how we are defining, oh, I can give the child the best life possible in purely materialistic terms. But the best life possible, I think, for a child includes a mother and a father who love them. And I think most people who have had good parents, especially thinking about it, would say, yeah, I wouldn't trade my good parents for more stuff or more vacations. That is completely beyond value. And looking at the birth rate as just purely a number or a term to increase totally ignores the point of looking at what is the best life, what is the purpose of family, which are deeper cultural problems that we have to address when we think about these things, which I think provides a good segue into the next question when we talk about what makes a good family and parenthood and child. So, Nucleus Genomics, an IVF genetic selection startup, bills itself as a catalyst for a world without heritable diseases. Sounds great. You responded on X and in articles calling out the inherent eugenic drive in startups like Nucleus Genomics, Orchid, Heliospect, My Own, Genomic Prediction. I think it's very clear that these are eugenics companies. What's less clear is how to respond to someone who receives that accusation and says, so what? In other words, the eugenics movement, spurred by Charles Darwin and promulgated with almost religious fervor in this country by Charles Davenport, Harry Laughlin, Madison Grant, was inhumane in its targeting of vulnerable communities and the forced sterilization laws that became Hitler's inspiration, but that those are really problems of application, and that ultimately the core of eugenic philosophy of purifying our genetic pool of humanity, that is an aspirational goal. And that now, with the sequencing of the human genome and the ability to use genetic editing with CRISPR, we finally have the means to execute a eugenic program that is ethical and even praiseworthy. Is there a flaw embedded in the philosophy of eugenics itself that exists apart from the practical implementation that led to past atrocities?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that final part of the question in particular is in like the 20th century of eugenics, we were dealing with people who were already born, right? People who were walking among us, they were disabled, they were maybe the wrong skin color, they had the wrong intellectual capability. But today, with Nucleus Genomics and Orchid and a number of these other companies, we're dealing with human beings at the embryonic stage, at a stage where it's one hotly contested if we should even attribute any personhood or value to that embryo, and two, that even if we do contribute some value to the embryo, if it should really matter what happens to the embryo, right? Because that small, very tiny embryo, right, at the earliest stages of human development looks nothing like you and I do today, even though if allowed to develop normally, it would, he or she would eventually do so. And so I think one of the things that has been so intentionally or unintentionally deceptive in that movement is the framing of Orchid, for example, whose tagline is "Have healthy babies." Nucleus Genomics says we should remove all heritable diseases. They frame the conversation around health, and they say, no, it's not eugenics. It's just science. We're helping you have healthy babies, and that right, like at face value seems great. We all want healthy babies. It's one of the most natural and like intuitive desires every parent person has. But what I think they're very unclear about, many cases just outright deceptive about, is that we're not talking about this abstract idea of wanting to heal a child embryo or improve their health. But what they're really saying is we should test each individual embryo. And then what these companies do is they assign a score for every disease or condition that they test for, and say your embryo has, say, a 90% chance of getting Alzheimer's, a 50% chance of insulin resistance, a 25% chance of hearing loss, and so on. And then you can look at those scorings for each of the embryos and say, what are the embryos that I want to use and what embryos do I want to destroy? And so it's picking winners and losers at this like inherent level of human life that's just far beyond anything we've seen in like the 20th century eugenics movement. But I would say is no less eugenics, because ultimately what you're doing is you're placing a conditional value on human life. And apart from any like moral pro-life language, medically, scientifically speaking, an embryo is a distinct and living organism with its own unique set of DNA that, if placed in the right environment, will grow into like a human being as you and I recognize one. And so there doesn't necessarily need to be moral language to recognize that. And what these companies are doing is then taking those embryos and assigning winners and losers based on their best technological guess at the content of this embryo. And I think what's important to note is the ability to test for certain diseases, what we would call monogenetic diseases or like single gene diseases, and to test for the sex of the embryo has been around for a very long time. I like to joke that there's no gender confusion in a fertility clinic because they can tell right away if they're looking at a boy embryo or a girl embryo. And so in the United States, we have about 450 fertility clinics. clinics, about 75% of those clinics allow for pre implantation genetic testing to look at single gene diseases like Down syndrome, Tay Sachs disease, cystic fibrosis, something like that. About 73% of those clinics allow you to test for things like the sex of the embryo. And it's very notable because most states don't allow abortion based on sex. Even our most blue states, right? You can't go in and say, I want abortion because it's the wrong sex. But in fertility clinics, that is in many cases just an assumed state that you can go in and say, I really want to have a girl and help me pick the girl embryo from the set that's most likely to succeed, and then destroy all of the other human embryos. But these companies like Nucleus Genomics take it to a whole new level where they're testing for 900 to 1200 polygenic conditions, which means conditions that develop based on the interplay between multiple genes, which means it's even more unreliable or more complicated to assess that. But they're going even further, and they're not simply looking at the health or the sex of the embryo, but they're assessing things like the potential IQ of the embryo or the potential personality of the embryo. So, what genetic combinations tend to create a more docile child? What combination tends to create a more kind or a more aggressive or a more ambitious child? And they're offering parents not just the opportunity to have a healthy baby, but to have the exact kind of baby they desire. But instead of being upfront and saying you are picking and choosing winners and losers, right? You're not increasing the intelligence. You're just trying to choose the embryo with the highest IQ based on the number of embryos you have. Um, and so that's why I've really framed it as this consumerist eugenics. If you have enough money, you can create and select the kind of child you desire. But yeah, and so in many ways, it is just a modern version of 20th century eugenics. But because it's dealing with embryonic life, I think it's a lot harder for people to grapple with in the same moral terms.
Mhm. Well, and also that it's just to play devil's advocate. Some of them are gonna make it and some of them are gonna be discarded, so why not choose the one that most closely matches? I am a buyer of a product, why not choose the best product has however I define that?
Right. Yeah, and this is what many of them frequently say, unfortunately. And so in those cases, if you frame it in that language, right? If like I'm the buyer, I can get whatever I want. Why shouldn't I pick the best possible child? I think that's where one I make the distinction between intentional and unintentional. So throughout conception, there are unintentional times where an embryo or a child doesn't make it right. An embryo doesn't continue developing, or even an implanted child doesn't continue developing, and you have a miscarriage or you have other complications. Those are unintentional and unnatural deaths to that child at each stage of development that are incredibly heartbreaking, right? And are far outside the control of parents. But what we're dealing with here is the intentional selection and destruction of human life. And so, one, intention matters. And then, two, I would say that in our society, I think by and large, like many people would agree that well, not everyone would agree though, that there are some things that ought to be beyond the scope of the market. And ultimately, having enough money is not a good enough justification for what you can and shouldn't do. And we have laws governing every aspect of society that says, no, there are some things that are far too intimate, far too sacred to simply be subjected to a monetary transaction. So prostitution is largely banned, even if it happens outside of the law, right? It's largely banned because we recognize that sex and that's sexual intimacy ought not be governed by the market. But when it comes to reproduction, this is, I think, where we have one of the last holdouts of this debate, right? Where we have surrogacy, where we have buying egg and sperm, where we have the creation of human life, where there has been this permissive view that if you can buy it, you should be able to. And I think that's where you just see a moral disagreement, right? Like just radically different worldviews at play with each other that should have good policy governing them. They should have very clear limitations placed on what can be done to human life. And a lot of that comes down to, I think, a longer and larger debate in the public square to really shift the thinking on this topic.
Mm. Why do you think a philosophy of eugenics seems to emerge from so-called elite classes intellectually and socioeconomically. And what do you think we lose by defining those markers as the pinnacle of human achievement?
Yeah. So this eugenics movement with embryonic genetic screening really comes out of a larger movement towards longevity and transhumanism that was largely birthed in Silicon Valley, and it is sort of making waves across the United States, culturally speaking. So for many years, you had individuals from Brian Johnson, Peter Thiel. To more normal researchers who were asking, how can we optimize human health to the highest degree? In some ways, the Maha movement is a sort of like normal, healthy version of this, right? Where it's like, how can we just like provide people with the best water, the best food, the best lifestyle so that they can thrive? But out of that movement, you had a number of individuals who started asking, or started saying really like we're spending so much time and money trying to optimize the health of an individual once they're born, once they're in their 20s, 30s, or older. What if we started at the most intimate state of embryonic life and actually optimized the longevity, the health of the embryo from the very beginning, where we have maximal control over the outcomes of the embryo? And so largely in elites, and this is sort of, I think this philosophy is like, uh, is natural among like our elite class of like, you want the best and you want to be the healthiest and the best you can be. And like on face value, that's great, right? We should all pursue excellence. This movement, though, of course, has taken it to a far different level where it's not simply pursuing excellence, right? But it's like picking and choosing which children are even born in the first place and then can pursue excellence from there. And so I think that's, and like if you saw online, like Brian Johnson was at Nucleus Genomics opening. There's a really close connection between the transhumanist longevity movement and this embryonic genetic screening movement. But what's so interesting to me is that embryonic genetic screening is only looking at the genetics of the embryo. Many of the conditions that they're testing for are not primarily genetic conditions, but environmental conditions. So, take, for example, Alzheimer's. About 96% of all Alzheimer's cases are traced back not to the genetics of the person, but to the environment and lifestyle that they lived. Only 4% of cases on average are due to a person's genetics. So, you may use embryonic genetic screening and say, wow, this embryo, barely has a chance of Alzheimer's. This is amazing. We should choose this embryo. That only accounts for 4% of the possibility, right? The other 96% will be governed by how they live their lives. So I think there's an expectation among certain elite circles who are using this technology that they will ensure that their kids then follow through with the lifestyle and have access to the things to ensure that they're the healthiest possible that they can be throughout every stage of their life, such that that 96% is not as big of a deal. But it's just no guarantee, right? And this is the case for almost all of the polygenic conditions that they're testing for, is that so much of it comes down to our environment and the life that we live. And even things, right, like we can be exposed to something that we don't expect, that we don't intend to be exposed to, that can cause any number of conditions. So it really in some ways, like I think, doesn't fully achieve what I think they're trying to do, because there's so much that could go wrong, quote unquote, right, in their worldview after that. But I think it's very appealing nonetheless, and it sort of follows like our marriage and dating trends too, right? Our marriage rates have been declining long before birth rates were declining, with hookup culture, the sexual revolution, no fault divorce. And today we've sort of reverted to this maybe somewhat dystopian approach to marriage that's reduced to dating apps with profiles and constant swiping. And we know that that's actually continued to suppress marriage rates, not necessarily help them, even though I know, and probably you know, people who have met and gotten married on these apps. And very similarly, I think we'll see a similar outcome here, where there are stories of individuals in Silicon Valley who say, well, why should we have kids now? Why not wait 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, when the technology is even better, when we can just use an artificial womb, when we have the ability to even edit the embryo to the exact kind of child that we want? Why would we have a kid now when we have even better technology to have a kid in the future? And now, of course, there's a couple of levels to this. One, what happens if you do have a kid in the future, but 5 years after that, the technology is even better? Are you going to have buyer's remorse for the child that you have? Like, it's sort of this infinite regression of there will always be better technology promised. And then two, I think that also just like tends to suppress birth rates in a very real sense, where if you make it about having the best possible kid who has the best possible life, then that's really, again, only possible for a certain very small percentage of society with those level of means, where then the average person won't be able to use IVF. They won't be able to pay for this advanced technological screening. And so I think it will cause like this further fracture in our society of who's having kids and why they're having kids. Um, yeah, but that's a long answer. I think like the elite mindset of this is just like going a couple of different directions. Yeah,
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting too that this kind of way of obtaining and optimizing children really flies in the face of what I think should be the ideal of parenthood, which is to offer unconditional love and sort of be drawn beyond yourself and stretched and become a more virtuous person by the self gift of oneself to your children. That's very opposite of designing a child that fits your desires. Those are two very different paradigms. And I think one tends to lend itself better to the building of virtue and generosity and love and acceptance that I think most people would agree is ideal in parenthood, still. But yeah, it's a little bit frightening to follow that line of thinking all
yeah,
the way to its natural ends.
yeah, because you're asking
Um,
your children to sacrifice for you rather than you, the parent, learning to sacrifice for your children, even when that means having a child with additional complications, right? That's maybe not the child you had in mind. But yeah, I think there's this just hubris in the industry that's incredibly foolish, assuming that we somehow know what's best for future generations to the point of like what kind of children are best for future generations, and not recognizing that to some degree providence and nature, right, do govern it, for our good, right, and reshape who we are as people through this self-sacrificial gift of parenthood, and also open the door for new kinds of people and new personalities, to be born in the world that we would never have imagined or guessed. And so I think a little beyond even what you're asking, there are two just like broader concerns that I have of one, we see trends in buying markets all the time, right? Like the new iPhone comes out, everyone wants the new iPhone. This new dress comes out, everyone has a variation of this dress. And I think there's a very real concern that there will also be trends in the kinds of things that people select for. Some people actually think that autism is a strength. So there's like a swath of parents actually choosing embryos based on autism, or what happens when people think like, oh, like kindness is the highest personality, we should have all the kind people, which is great, but people who were overly dispositioned to kindness for a whole generation probably don't protect your borders in a time of war very well, or if you choose a very aggressive generation, right, like it's probably not good for like the domestic health of your nation. And so there's a real concern that like these sorts of trends in children weaken society overall. And then the second thing, and I mean this like somewhat humorously, but I think the point stands, is imagine if the boomer generation or fill in the blank generation had access to this technology. What kind of children and personalities and IQ and health would they have chosen? Is that really what you or I wanted to be created and born and lived as? And based on the like pretty strong like reaction to boomers and older generations, I think most people would say absolutely not. Like we actually really like the sort of cultural generational distinctions that we have, that have by and large developed sort of naturally in response to our own context and previous people. But how much, yeah, but like how much of that do we actually lose with embryonic genetic screening because we take away that natural variation, at a very fundamental level if it's adopted wide scale?
yes, taking that stereotype of the former quarterback of the high school football team who wants his son to continue in his footsteps, but his son just wants to pursue science or musical theater, and but at a very genetic level, trying to exert control over who your child becomes rather than allowing them to flourish and unfold as a gift.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you have written extensively about the problems that arise when we use technology as a substitute rather than a supplement to human flourishing. Can you explain the difference and why this distinction is so critical?
Yes. So that distinction of substitution versus supplement comes from Joshua Mitchell, who is a professor at Georgetown University. And he's used this in many different contexts. I've applied it specifically to the question of technology. So, what I mean and what Joshua Mitchell means, or at least my interpretation of what Joshua Mitchell means when he uses this, is that for a technology to substitute the human person, it means that in some way our use of that technology is replacing a natural human function or natural human experience. So, take the topic of IVF, for example, right? IVF results in the creation of a human embryo if everything goes correct. But in order to create that human embryo, you're actually substituting the human person or the human body and creating it not through the natural intercourse between a man and a woman, but in a laboratory setting with technicians who are like artificially like placing your egg and sperm in a petri dish and hoping that it turns into an embryo. And that scenario, I would say that we're actually we're using IVF to substitute a natural human function in a way that it, at base value, right, like introduces a number of complications into our understanding of what it means to be human, the well-being of the child, and so on. When I talk about technology supplementing, at that point, we're talking about ways that technology can actually help encourage or help achieve a natural human outcome. So, a very basic example of this is like the use of glasses or a prosthetic arm, right? It's not substituting your ability to see, but those glasses are helping supplement your natural eyes so that they can see in a way as they ought to, right? Without any issues or like natural weaknesses that come with time and age. And so I'm very interested in the development of technologies that will further supplement the human person and human flourishing. So things like the development of different approaches to treating infertility, for example, broadly fall under the category of like restorative reproductive medicine. But this can mean everything from addressing tubal blockages that may prohibit a woman from naturally conceiving a child, or addressing conditions like endometriosis, or any number of factors, right? And it actually involves a high level of technological sophistication, not only to identify and diagnose the cause of infertility, but then to actually address all the factors contributing to it. But I think any use of technology in that sense, right, is just supplementing what the body naturally does. It's not necessarily substituting the body with this like outside mechanical means of creating a child. So yeah, that's the distinction at a basic
Yeah.
level.
No, absolutely. And this season, we will be having on Dr. Stacy Trasingos to talk about IVF in a little bit more detail, and Grace Emily Stark, the editor at Natural Womanhood, to talk about her policy wish list and other things about restorative reproductive medicine. So keep an eye out for those episodes. Um, Speaking of technologies that either substitute or supplement, can you explain the process and purpose behind three-parent children, and what are the concerns around this technology?
Yeah, so this is something that has sort of had a few different moments in our cultural conversation, and most recently in like the mid 20, like before and after 2020s. And so with three parent embryos, what you're talking about here is um, typically there's a few variations, but like typically when we talk about three parent embryos, we're talking about the replacement of an embryo or a cell's nucleus with another embryo or cell's nucleus. And so what that means is if you have, say, um, one embryo that is, or say like you have like sperm, egg, and like the sperm and the egg of like the intended parents who want to raise the child may have, like the egg, for example, may have a condition where it's less likely to create a viable embryo, or it could convey some heritable disease to the child. What they would do is they would actually take that woman's egg with another woman's egg that didn't have those same conditions, and they would replace key parts of her egg with genetic material from the other egg. And so you would end up with a child who had genetic parents in three different places, one man, two women, in order to sort of offset and piece together the healthiest possible egg to create the healthiest possible embryo. In the United States, that technology or that process is not it. It's not allowed. So if you were to apply to the FDA and say, I'd like to create a three-parent embryo, they wouldn't even respond. It's like it's illegal. We don't pursue that route. Um, but it hasn't been tested or really like pushed back on in a number of years. So the United Kingdom is one of the most prominent countries that has developed this technology, primarily for the purpose of addressing or trying to like sidestep any potential health concerns that may be present in that woman. And so it, in many ways, it's sort of trying to walk this middle ground where if you're concerned about using your own egg, your own genetic material in creating a child, but you don't just want to buy another woman's egg to create a child, right? Such that you, as the intended mother, would have no biological connection to the child. This sort of provides a way where you, quote unquote, get the best of both worlds, where you're still passing down genetic material to the child, but you're removing the parts that you find problematic and supplementing it with, or substituting it really with someone else's. So that's like a very basic description of three parent embryos. It hasn't gained as much stamina in the United States, but it is certainly something, like I said, that the United Kingdom is utilizing.
Mm. Now, as I understand it, researchers have also been able in animal models to reprogram adult stem cells into gametes, eggs and sperm, thus enabling genetic conception between same sex pairings or even from a single person. How far are we from human use, and what are the implications of this type of technology?
Yes. So what you're describing is called in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG. And as you said, there are two different variations depending on if you're working with egg or sperm. But at the most basic level, you're taking a stem cell, some DNA, so some of my skin cells, hair, or blood, for example, or even like your saliva, right? And you're genetically transforming that into a viable egg or sperm. So this is a very like complex process, obviously. But as you noted, this has been achieved in mice in Japan in particular, where they were able to genetically modify I think DNA from a mouse's tail into viable egg, and then use that in reproduction to create multiple generations of mice from it. So it requires the use of IVF, right? Because you're then extracting egg or sperm. But because you can genetically modify or transform that given DNA into egg or sperm, it means that your biological sex is actually secondary to the process. So women naturally create eggs, men naturally create sperm in the process of procreation. But using IVG, a man could contribute his own sperm and then genetically modify one of his skin cells into being a viable egg that's totally from his DNA. So it'd be his DNA, right? Like his person, but in a genetically modified egg. And then through IVF, he could actually have his sperm fertilize his egg to create an embryo that was 100% related to him. The same could also work with same sex couples, where a woman could contribute her egg and her partner could then genetically modify a skin cell into sperm and then fertilize that egg such that two women would actually be the genetic parents of a given child. Um, and so, if you look in Japan, for example, where they're most advanced in this technology, the primary motivation that they have noted is to help women who are born without eggs. Now, this is a very rare condition, but it's certainly a condition that women throughout the world suffer from, where they physically don't have any eggs to have children, which is can be incredibly heartbreaking because it means that there isn't anything you can really do right to naturally restore that. And so their hope is that this technology could then use their own DNA to create eggs so that they can have the children they desire. In the context of the United States, the primary company working on this is Bioconceptions. Bioconception says that their primary motivation is to allow same sex couples to have children. And there are a number of same sex couples working at this company. In the United States and really across the world, so we know that Japan has started testing with human DNA to try to create a mature egg in particular. They've not achieved this goal yet. I think they've gotten like very rudimentary versions, but it hasn't continued developing to the point of a mature and viable egg. In the United States, Bioconceptions has claimed that Bioconceptions is working with human DNA. They claim that they're making progress on it, but even folks in the industry have said, we haven't seen the paper, we haven't seen the research, we have no idea really how far they've gotten. So I think the folks in the space have said that it's anywhere maybe around like 5 to 10 years before we expect to see a viable human embryo egg created through this process, or sperm. Um, but who knows, right? Like maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But the concerns with this are, I think, very clear, which is one, it will radically change our understanding of human conception, because it will no longer require a given man and a given woman to create a child. Any number of children, really an infinite number of children, could be created from any given individual, with or without the support of another man or woman. And what's even more heartbreaking is you don't even have to have a fully developed person, right? Or like human being, like grown human being. You can have an embryo, and you can take the genetic material from that embryo and then genetically modify that into egg sperm embryo, right? And continue the process of procreating multiple generations, just from the embryonic stage, not even from like the born adult human stage. And so there's, I think, a number of concerns, or like a number of problems this introduces. But in many ways, what it's doing is it's taking our legal redefinition, and where states like California say that any person or persons can be the parents of a child, right? They have parent number one, parent number two. It doesn't matter your sex, use IVF, you can be a parent. And it takes that legal definition and it turns it into a biological definition, where quite literally, should the technology succeed, any two men could actually be the biological parents of the child. But we know that, again, when it comes to child well-being and parenthood, it's not just about, do you have the parts available to have a child? Do you have the financial support? Do you have two people who love you? There's an incredibly important relationship of a biological father, a biological mother raising a child, and what they bring to the table when it comes to the child's identity, their sense of self, who they are, and the nurture and care and protection they need that come uniquely in some ways from a given mother and a given father. I mean, it totally evaporates that and says, oh, any parent will do, any genetic material will do, as long as you can create a child, it doesn't really matter. And so in many ways, like the concerns that people have with surrogacy or with donor egg and sperm donation, it just magnifies those on a whole new level, where it is biologically sort of erasing the necessity of a mother and a father to a child's life.
Yeah. So mind-blowing societal questions and issues. If they're using the genetic material of a single person to create a new human embryo, is this a new type of cloning? I mean, reproductive cloning has been unilaterally banned, but is this something that is a clone, or is it resulting in a genetically different individual using the same pool of genetics, just mixed up a little bit differently, to create progeny from the genetics of one person instead of two?
Yeah, very, very good question. It's a really good question. I don't actually know the answer to that. It's
Okay.
really good. So it could result in a cloning situation. I don't know if it's possible to reconfigure the genetics in such a way that like you could actually have a total, because yeah, I mean you're 100% genetically related, so there's no genetic variation in the child that's created. But can you emphasize a certain gene over another in a way that's different from that individual? It seems like you could, but I'm not totally sure. It's a really good question, actually. I'll need to like, yeah, bug some of our researchers about this and see.
Yeah, good to follow up on. Do you have like a litmus test or simple way to sort out the types of technologies and research that we should pursue and fund, and those that are revolutionary or incredible, scientifically, though they may be, are fundamentally opposed to human flourishing?
Yeah, this is something that, like, going forward, I want to develop out even further than what we have. But a few of the litmus tests that I like to apply, is one at a very basic level, asking, does this technology restore human life or restore human function, or does it circumvent it? Or the question of supplement versus substitute. I think it's a really important first question to ask, when we're assessing the goodness or potential concerns of a technology. So if you can say, no, this technology clearly clearly is restoring the health or the genetic health, the physical health of a person, and then that's a good thing, right? Whereas if we're actually removing a human element, that should be a concern. But it's not a total answer, right? Because like prosthetic arms are technically like replacing a human arm, right? But in a way that like we'd actually say it's a good substitution because it's sort of enabling like what would have been a natural human function. The next question, something for me that's a non-negotiable, is are we destroying human life in pursuit of that given goal? So the moment that a human embryo is formed and is that unique, complete embryo, any technology that destroys or harms or commodifies that embryo, I think should be an absolute no when it comes to our society. If we cannot value and protect life at that most intimate and sacred stage of development, then we will have no moral authority or ability to protect life at any other stage of development. Whatever the situation may be, right? And so, any technology that is destroying or commodifying human life at any stage, including the embryonic, I think is across the line to begin with. And so the question of does it restore, circumvent, and does it destroy life are sort of the first two litmus tests that I go to. And so, yeah, if you can find a technology that's not destroying human life that seems to be supplementing, it's good. I think the second level of questions then I would ask come from Marshall McLuhan. And he has these sorts of he puts forward four questions that you can ask about any technology. And Marshall McLuhan is a 20th century philosopher just writing about the nature of technology itself. So he asks first, what does it enhance or intensify? So, what does this technology encourage? Second, what does it render obsolete or displace? So, what does this technology intentionally or unintentionally actually deter in our society? Third, what does this technology retrieve that was previously obsolete? So, is it bringing back something, right? Like Nucleus Genomics is actually retrieving 20th century eugenics, and not in a way that I think any sane person should be in favor of. And then fourth, what does this technology produce or become when it's pressed to an extreme? So this question, right, is meant to say like a given technology, like at its most basic level, may be fine or like morally neutral or even potentially good for society. But what happens if we were to take this technology and press it to its most extreme expression? So, for example, asking ChatGPT, hey, I'm looking to create a meal with these ingredients. What can I create with these ingredients I have? That's great. I love using ChatGPT to like brainstorm solutions to everyday problems.
Good.
But what happens when ChatGPT's ability to communicate with you isn't just helping you like brainstorm like problems like that, but actually becomes this sort of partner that you talk to, where you then have your chatbot girlfriend or boyfriend, or your romantic partner, where they aren't just like a tool you use to solve domestic problems, but it becomes a replacement, a substitute for people in your life, and you're actually in love with and proposing to your chatbot romantic partner, right, which is already happening in the world. ChatGPT pressed to the extreme in that sense is actually really, really bad for human relationships and human well-being. And so those four questions aren't meant to say that something is inherently good or bad depending on where it falls, but they allow us to ask and understand the nature of a technology, I think, a little bit better, so we can actually say, okay, like what is a responsible use of this technology? Because in many cases, aside from things like genetic screening that we've talked about, things like genetic therapy, I think they're, like you and I said, I think there are versions of it that are very good for society that I think would be very good to develop, and there's versions of it that I think are very, very bad for society, and it's going to require those very particular questions about the given approach, or like the given technique used, to really understand what is good and what we should avoid, or prohibit in that space.
Yeah. One of the ways that you have distinguished between those things is hacking humans through
Yes.
like surrogacy, gender surgery, euthanasia versus healing them. And I love that distinction, not just because of the alliteration, but I think it's a very useful way to think about it.
Yeah. Also, yeah, that's a New Atlantis article, The Hacking of the Human Person, which is I wrote with two of my colleagues, but yes, goes into that distinction. Yeah,
I can link that in the show notes also.
awesome.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I have one last question to ask you that is a standard question to ask all our guests. So, who is one person, alive or dead, real or fictional, who you believe exemplifies the very best of being human?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yes, it's such a fun question too. The person that comes to mind, yeah, I don't know. I've gone back and forth on this question a few times. Yeah, the person that comes to mind right now is my daughter. She is 2 years old, and while she's still very young in her, development and growth as a human person, she's at this incredible stage where she's learning and discovering a million new things every day from her speech, from her experiences, and has this just a really lovely, unique perspective on the world from her little tiny stature and her mind. And so, what I've loved to see is the way that, like, I think she like exhibits the human condition in such a raw and honest way where 1 second she just covers you in hugs and has this like pure joy and delight when she meets another human, to the point where we have to tell her, you shouldn't actually like give a stranger a hug from behind. They might think it's a little aggressive. And she's like, I'm so excited to see you. And you're like, please don't get upset. To like having these horribly selfish and like terrible moments where she just like takes a toy from her sister just because she can and she wants to. It's just, yeah, I think she does, where it's like this desire to like be hospitable, give whatever she has in one moment. And then other moments where, yeah, she's a sinful toddler and is just like terrible and mean, but is learning to really interact with the world and realize her own limitations, right? So she climbed out of her crib today, which was a terrifying development for me. But seeing her like grapple with her human limitations, where sometimes she overestimates them and she gets hurt, and other times you see her like rightly navigate it. And it's so exciting and encouraging. And I think those very basic lessons that we're learning at that age apply on all levels, right? Because ultimately, with technology and with the opportunities before us, we are asking that question of what is a good human limitation? What is the fullness of the human person? What are limitations we should respect? And what is this like joy filled, cheerful way that we should interact with the world that really views life itself as a gift?
It's beautiful. Beautiful way to reflect on parenthood and a lovely way to close. Where can listeners connect with you, follow your work, and read more of your work?
Yes, so you can follow me on X or Twitter at EML Waters, or you can look up my Heritage Foundation profile, just the Heritage Foundation Emma Waters, where most of the articles that I publish are linked, for, yeah, your enjoyment later on.
Excellent. I will put all of those things in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time today. Especially generous. We've gone a little bit over. I really appreciate your time and your reflection. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.
If this episode raised questions or sparked thoughts you'd like to explore further, I'd love to continue the conversation with you over on Substack at bravenewus.substack.com. Your comments and insights there help to build the kind of thoughtful community this show was made for. To support Brave New Us, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen, or become a paid subscriber on Substack. Your support makes it possible to keep bringing you these ad-free episodes. Thank you for listening and being part of the journey into what it means to be human in the age of biotechnology.